So we just finished the dexterity builds. Now we're going to cover 5 different strength builds based on DLC weapons. Now there's going to be lots of really popular DLC options that are strength based that are not going to be on this list. And that's because I probably already made builds on those weapons. You can go check out my other build videos if you did want to know about them. I'll just link it down below. But as always, the builds are at level 150. All the gameplay is regular new game. And I do have a plus 16 Shadow Realm blessing for the DLC. The Anvil Hammer can be one of the hardest hitting weapons in the entire game. In fact, if you are at max level, this can actually have the highest amount of AR compared to every other weapon. It is a colossal weapon with just the regular colossal weapon moveset, which might be a bit slow, but it does get high amounts of stance damage in return. Does also get some split fire damage as well, and a really good strength and faith based scaling. We are going to go in roughly about split even strength and faith. Even though it does scale better with strength, if you just have it two-handed, you're going to get 50% more strength to help meet the soft caps quicker anyway. So it is going to benefit of going into more faith, which is going to mean more spell damage, and it's going to help us meet the minimum requirements for some spells too. But this weapon's skill, Smithing Art Spears, is also amazing. It does a short range AoE attack, which is very reminiscent of Eruption, but it can do just as much damage, get amazing hyper armor, but it also does incredible stance damage. So to obviously build around this, we're going to have the Shard of Alexander for this more skill damage. If we're going to be proccing stance breaks really quickly, we can go with the Blade of Mercy, which is 20% more damage after every single critical attack. Now the skill doesn't have the quickest animation, so in most cases you're still going to want to use your light attacks. So we do have the two-handed talisman equipped, and to help trade out with enemies, we are going to have the Dragon Crest Great Shield talisman, because that is going to be a bunch more physical damage negation. We do also have pieces of the Rakshasa set equipped, which is 2% damage for every single piece. Now with a strength and faith build, we're obviously going to have the Claw Mark Seal, which is just the best one at this level. And we could just use a bunch of different types of spells. I like Knight's Lightning Spear as it's a single target projectile option, Pest Thread Spears for those really large bosses. Rotten Butterflies is actually really good. It procs Scarlet Rot instantly, and this is going to be 30% damage over the next 90 seconds, which is good against all these really large bosses, especially if you are in New Game Plus. You can have Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike as an AoE spell, and then obviously Golden Vow, Flame Grant Me Strength for just more damage negation. And we can have Blessing of the Erdtree, which is like the best health regen spell to use in the game, and is going to help offset the blood-sucking cracks tier that we do have, which is 20% more damage, but it does drain roughly 1% HP per second. And for your other crystal tier slots, you can go multiple different ways. I'm just going to go with the Faith tier to just help us get a bit more damage out of our spells. If you cared more about weapon damage, you can just go with the Strength tier, or once again, just going into damage negation or stamina boosting stuff is going to work fine too. The Ancient Meteoric or Greatsword I consider to be one of the best colossal swords in the game. Does have the most range in class, does get amazing damage, gets a really good strength and arcane based scaling, and it does have a really solid moveset, specifically with the heavy attack as it is a nice poke, very similar to the Zweihander. So this can be the highest damaging piercing attack in the entire game with these poking attack colossal swords. And as I always mention, piercing damage is the best damage type in the game. Lots of enemies are weaker to it, and it does bonus damage when enemies are in the middle of an attack combo. But arguably the best part about this weapon is going to be its skill White Light Charge. For 10 FP, you just lunge so far towards an enemy and is closing the distance basically instantly, which is just useful in so many different situations. You can kind of treat it like a projectile attack, but your character is the projectile. And for an additional 25 FP, you can do a little AoE attack that does do high amounts of damage, send smaller enemies flying, and the entire combo can do roughly 36 stance damage. Now this AoE effect does actually scale off AR, so going into strength or arcane is going to help benefit, and it does mainly do physical damage as well. Now this weapon skill is going to be a longer animation, so it's not going to be the most useful thing to use throughout every single boss fight, but in that instance you can just use the heavy attack instead. So we're going to build around both of these things, the Shard of Alexander for the weapon skill, the two-handed sword talisman for just 15% more damage just by having the weapon two-handed, and that's going to boost all types of damage except for the skill and critical attacks. The Axe Talisman for 10% more charge attack damage. And the last talisman slot can just be anything to boost your neutral game. I'm going to go with the Dragon Crest Great Shield talisman just for more damage negation. Now for most strength builds, you can always go with a projectile option, whether it be using a Great Bow, the Claw Mark Seal with some spells. In this build, I'm just going to throw on the Dragon Communion Harpoon. You do have to farm for these, and you can only hold 5 at a time, but it is just nice to have it as a projectile option, just in case bosses just go too far away from you, you can just throw it out, just to maintain damage and to stop enemies from regenerating their poise. But it's not that necessary to have a projectile option, as your skill can just cover so much distance anyway. But it does scale very well with strength, so this build is going to have a lot of that. You can honestly go split even strength arcane if you wanted to, because two-handing the weapon will actually give you a 50% strength boost and has helped meet the soft caps a bit quicker. So in that instance, you just might benefit of just going into a lot of arcane despite that descaling that it does get. But I did go into a bit more strength just to utilize some more physical damage negation. And if I wanted to use certain types of projectiles, in this instance, the Dragon Communion Harpoon. But with every single build, as always, go into 15 Faith so you can use things like Flame Grant Me Strength, Bestial Vitality or Damage Negation spells. And I also do have the Spiked Cracks tier for more charge attack damage and the Blood Sucking Cracks tier for 20% more damage, but it does drain my health. So if this was an issue for you, you could put on the Strength tier or have like a Stamina boosting tier instead. And as always, having Golden Vow onto a dagger and just throw it into your back pocket, you're just going to benefit. The Red Bear's Claw did actually recently get buffed to where it does get a bunch more damage and hype armor with its skill, and it actually now turns it into an S tier weapon because this skill can straight up just melt so many enemies in this game, stun lock those smaller enemies really quickly, and just output so much blood loss put up that it could just cheese every single one of these encounters. Now, it is still going to be a Beast Claw, so its moveset is probably not going to be as good as a regular Claw, as regular Claws can just have much faster movesets, output higher DPS, and is more bleed. But one attack that I do like about the Beast Claws is going to be its running heavy attack. It does come out really fast and it can just do some nice amounts of damage. So basically, we're just going to keep alternating between spamming the weapon skill and spamming running heavy attacks. So to build around this, we're going to have the Shard of Alexander for more skill damage, the Lord of Blood Exaltation alongside the White Mask for just more damage every single time that we do proc bleed. We also have the Letters Armor on, as this actually does boost your rolling attacks and running attacks by 10%. And as I mentioned, with the running heavy attacks being really good, it is going to make for a nice pairing. We do also have the Thorny Cracked tier, which is going to be more damage with excessive attacks. Works the exact same way as the Millicent's Prosthesis that we do have on, which also does give us plus 5 to Dexterity, which is going to help us meet the minimum requirements of the Rebath's cannon. As I always mentioned, you always want to have at least one projectile option for every single type of build. There are lots of different options for strength builds, but I do want to highlight the Rebath's cannon as it does perform really well. Now we do also have the Arrow's Soaring Sting Talisman on, which is going to help out with the damage of the cannon. Now, if you didn't plan to use a cannon, you could just switch out these talismans for like the Rotten Wing Sword insignia instead. But the reason why the Rebath's cannon is really good is because it has insane tracking. This thing can hit enemies at such far distances, and if you just use it while aimed away and then lock on at the last second, enemies are not going to react to it nor input read it, and it's going to track straight towards them. And it can do some decent damage and send smaller enemies flying. Now, unfortunately for ballistas, they don't actually have any scalings, but that does have really high strength requirements, and using it with a lighter type of weapon like the Beast Claws is going to make for a nice pairing because these things can be pretty heavy. So that's why we do have 30 endurance just to give us a bunch more equipment load, and the Beast Claws actually do consume a lot of stamina with their skill, so it just makes sense overall just to have this much endurance. Now, once again, just having pieces of the Rakshasa set equipped is going to be nice. Every single piece is 2% damage. The Blood Sucking tier, once again, 20% more damage over the next 3 minutes, but it does drain roughly 1% HP per second. And to help offset this, we can use Bestial Vitality spell. And with the 15 Faith that we have spec'd into, also Flame Grant Me Strength, and potentially some damage negation spells if you wanted to go that route instead. And if you actually did some farming, then using the Golden Vow consumable is going to be really nice. It does result in like 15% damage and roughly 8% damage negation for the next 45 seconds. But if farming for these things were too tedious, just put the Golden Vow onto a dagger and it's going to serve you just as well. The Smith Script Shield and the Carian Thrusting Shield are some of the best shields in the entire game, and we're going to use both of these in this same strength build. Now, the Smith Script Shield is just going to be a very solid projectile option. You're not going to use it as a shield to try and block anything, but for every single build, I always recommend just having one type of projectile option. And if you're using a strength build, you can just go slap on the Smith Script Shield because it does really decent damage. It's easy to spam, low stamina cost, only 3 FP. It's just really good. But the main weapon of choice is the Carian Thrusting Shield, because this Thrusting Shield does get really high guard boost and really high physical guarded damage negation, does scale best with a strength build, so it's going to go all into that. We're also going to have it infused with Cragblade and just spam R1 and spam guard counters, because unironically, the Thrusting Shields probably have the best R1 spam potential and are some of the best guard countering weapons too. And that's because they do high stance damage, they're really quick, and they do get blocking frames with these attacks. You can just constantly spam R1, do about 12 stance damage for every single hit, and potentially just block attacks while you're doing it. If you wanted to guarantee blocking frames, you do have like an actual blocking attack by just holding onto the block button and just spamming R1. That could work too. But I think the best potential of this is just going to be guard countering alongside the Deflect tier, which this is the best crystal tier in the game. It lasts 5 minutes. It gives you the ability to perfectly block. So when you click the block button at the exact time you get hit, it basically negates all damage. You take a lot less stamina damage, and it can boost your guard counter damage by up to 80% and give you a whole bunch more stance damage too, depending on how many times you deflect before guard countering. But the reason why I value this guard counter so much is because it does get blocking frames in the recovery animation. So normally when you get stuck in these longer animations when doing a guard counter, you might be able to get staggered out of it. But with a Thrusting Shield, you can just use it in the middle of a boss combo, get off your attack really quickly, and then just block the next incoming attack, and then you can go ahead and guard counter that one too. It's just an easy to use and very exploitable playstyle that it can just trivialize so many different types of encounters. So this build doesn't really need any types of damaging skills at all. You just buffer with Cragblade and just go ahead and spam your attacks. But as for the talismans, obviously the two-handed sword talisman, which is 15% more damage to all of your attacks, curved sword talisman for more guard counter damage, this spear talisman because this weapon does do mainly piercing damage. And if you're just blocking and attacking at the same time, more likely than not, you're just hitting throughout an enemy's combo. And the spear talisman is just going to enhance that counter-attack damage. And with the deflect tier and getting some guard counters, you can get well over 40 stance damage and get lots of critical attacks off. So we're going to have the Blade of Mercy equipped as well, which is just a bunch more damage after every single critical attack. And then once again, going into 15 Faith to use things like Flame Gummy Strength, Bestial Vitality, which is just more health regen and more damage. And we do also have the Thorny Cracked tier as well, because these attacks do come out really fast, so you can just constantly spam R1 over and over again, and you can just get up to 20% more damage with this tier. And I do have the Golden Vow item on my character, which is just a better version of the Ash of War, but you do have to farm for it. So if you don't have access to this consumable, just go throw on Golden Vow onto a dagger. The Horned Warrior's Greatsword is a new curved sword that does utilize a bunch of these storm attacks with its weapon skill that is very similar to Stormcaller in that it spins around a whole bunch and can stunlock these smaller enemies, but it is going to be slightly different. It's not going to stunlock as well as Stormcaller Ash of War, as that one does have quicker follow-up inputs to where it can have guaranteed combos, whereas this one does have a delay between the first and second combo, which is going to be a downside, but this actually does have two separate things going for it. One is its incredible range. It hits really far, and if you're ever surrounded by a bunch of enemies, this thing can just clean out entire rooms of them very easily. And it also does have quicker animations too. For regular Stormcaller, you get stuck in like a 3-swing animation, whereas this one is only a 2-swinging animation. So it is easier to use throughout the middle of a boss fight, especially against enemies that do give you smaller openings. Now against enemies that don't get staggered as well, you're probably still better off using the light attack combos or the heavy attacks, which is still perfectly fine because it is a very high damaging curved greatsword, which these weapons do have good DPS and output a decent amount of stance damage too. And being that it does have a good strength and faith scaling, we can pair it alongside the Clawmark Seal and a bunch of spells that are going to help us out greatly. But as for the talismans, obviously the Shard of Alexander and the Enraged Divine Beast talisman, these are just going to further enhance the skill damage. And we do have both of the multi-hit talismans, the Rotten Wing Sword Insignia and the Millicent's Prosthesis. Being that the skill can hit in quick succession and the light attacks can hit pretty quickly too, you can actually stack up these buffs very quickly and it's output a lot of damage. We are also going to have the Thorny Cracked tier as well, which does work the same way but up to 20% more damage. Now if you did notice that you did need more survivability, you could switch out one of these things for like a Damage Negation Talisman or something for more health regen. And as for the other crystal tier slots, you can go the Blood Sucking Cracked tier, which is 20% more damage, but it does make you drain roughly 1 HP per second over time. You could also use the Faith tier as well to just help you meet the minimum requirements for a bunch more spells, which speaking of which, Knight's Lightning Spear for a single target option does do really high stance damage. Enemies don't really dodge or react to it either. Pest Thread Spears is amazing against large bosses. Rotten Butterflies or Scarlet Aeonia to help proc Scarlet Rot at the beginning of the fight, and it is going to be the 30% damaging version. Catch Flame for the enemies weaker to fire damage, and you can go ahead and use Golden Vow and Flame Gummy Strength for more damage and defenses. Now, if you were going to go with the Blood-Sucking Cracked tier, then you can go ahead and throw in Blessing of the Erdtree as well, as it will just give you a bunch of health regen and try and negate the effects of the Blood-Sucking tier. Now, that is going to require you to go to about 38 faith, so I kind of recommend going into at least that much, and is putting the rest of the points into strength. You're not going to really benefit much by going past 54 strength if you do plan on two-handing the weapon, because being that two-handing gives you 50% more strength, it's going to help you meet the soft cap of 80 strength. So going into split even strength and faith is going to be perfectly fine. Anyway, that is the video now done. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. As for the next video, probably going to rank all the remembrances, or the DLC remembrances at least, based on importance of duplication. So if you are interested in that video, please do subscribe. And also, I do a bunch of challenge runs on Twitch every single day, so give me a follow there if you do want to check that out. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.